Welcome to Rock Docs, Season 2, Episode 1, a podcast about music documentaries. I'm David Lizerbram.
I'm Andrew Keatts.
Today we are going to talk about the famed, notorious 2021 Beatles documentary, Get Back. You may have heard of that.
Yes.
But before you do, we always kind of have a little topic of the day. Mm-hmm. The topic I wanted to address is, since we're talking about the Beatles, why there are so few well-known prominent rock docs. I mean, there's tons of prominent rock docs about music stars of the 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way to today. But very few from the pre-Beatles rock and roll era for the 50s. You know, your Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard.
Bill Haley.
Bill Haley, sure.
Yeah.
Carl Perkins.
Sure.
Clyde McPhatter and the Drifters.
Right.
Where's my Clyde McPhatter? Rock
Music
doc?
Box, Clyde McPhatter and the Drifters.
Come on, Bill Simmons.
On HBO this spring.
We're doing development for you here.
Yeah.
Why do you think that era has been less fertile?
My guess is that it's because there is not nearly as much source material to draw from. That there's not as good footage, there's not as good audio, live footage, and also that some of the people are dead, so you can't interview them today. And so it's you end up making much more of a historical document, much more of a Ken Burnsian documentary than a Music Box documentary. That's my guess.
Okay, I think there's part of that. Although, I mean, there's certainly some of those people are still alive today or lived for a long time, so there's got to be some footage. Yeah. But I think it's kind of more of a cultural thing in my view, because I feel like that music, rightly or wrongly, has been kind of gotten this baggage of the like American Graffiti, Happy Days, Johnny Rockets, kitschy 50s, white bread nostalgia. Yeah. When in fact, if you really look into any of those people and their lives, they're as dramatic, as much sex, drugs, rock and roll,
and worse.
Yeah, financial catastrophes, plane crashes, all kinds of stuff as you would want in any other rock doc. And I think it's just been overlooked.
Yeah, I think I have the sense that something has changed over the course of my life. I would say maybe 25, 30 years ago, like the oldies but goodies radio channel was not quite as it was not looked as, it was not frowned upon the way that it is now. It sort of was prominently on the dial next to the classic rock radio station, and I feel like now it's almost like the big band radio station,
Right. For some reason, the like 60s stuff retains the cultural cachet. It's like that's in color, and all this other stuff is in black and white. Or something. I mean, to some extent, literally, but.
And I remember in Maryland when I was growing up, the 100.3 was the oldie station, 94.7 was the classic rock station, and you could hear the Beatles on both.
Right. There was an overlap. The Beatles, maybe a little Beach Boys.
Yes, Beatles and Beach Boys definitely, but like not the Rolling Stones.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, no, the oldie station was locked in on my dad's Cadillac. No question. And it's just I think it's kind of a bummer. And I think maybe we're going to see it, or maybe it remains to be seen. We did get a little bit of that in the Tina documentary.
We did, which
was awesome. So if there's that for many other artists, please, we're dying to see it.
Chuck Berry seems like low hanging fruit.
Yes,
if for no other reason than to correct the historical record introduced by Back to the Future.
Yeah, it turns out that was not actually a rock doc.
Right.
No, Chuck Berry's life was in parts horrifying and disgusting. Yeah. And he got up to a lot of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
It's it would be a fruitful era.
And like especially the beginning of it, like it was such a counter-cultural, almost anti-social thing.
Right.
To be in these early rock clubs.
And there was no precedent for it.
No.
It's just kind of like, it came out of nowhere, kind of. So we're out here asking,
We're asking the tough questions. No, yeah, I would be interested in that. Also, a topic like the barnstorming tours where Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis, Johnny Cash were all on the same bill.
Yeah,
seems like there's got to be good stories around that stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I think now is the time to do it because like some of the people are still alive, the participants, but certainly people that were there, involved in one way or the other, or just fans, they're around, but they're not going to be around forever.
Yes,
so let's get that. Mm-hmm. Let's do it. Let's
get back.
Speaking of getting back, I'm going to attempt to do a 45-second capsule summary in case somebody, for some reason, let's imagine some future civilization discovers this episode of Rock Docs.
Some college kid was on like a semester abroad.
Yeah.
And just came back and was like, wait, what happened after Thanksgiving?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, so Thanksgiving weekend 2021 on the Disney Channel, Disney Plus, or Get Back dropped. Mm-hmm. This is basically what happened was, very briefly, in 1969, the Beatles got together in a movie studio they kind of self-imposed this deadline of a few weeks to write and record a record that would have some kind of live performance attached to it. It was kind of going to be a throwback. They're going to do kind of old style music, not as elaborate or composed as like the Sgt. Pepper type stuff. And it was filmed. The entire thing was filmed for some kind of documentary or movie they were going to make out of it. And over the course of that time, George Harrison briefly left or walked out and was enticed back in. They, went through some ups and downs over several weeks, came up with the songs that eventually became the Let It Be album, recorded, performed their famous last concert, which was on the roof of Abbey Road Studios. And then it was kind of shelved. It was released in, I think, 70 or 71 as a 2-hour documentary that was generally considered to be pretty bleak and kind of presented the band as breaking up. And really was just kind of buried after that. There's been bits and pieces seen, but it's not really available anywhere. Peter Jackson somehow got access to all this original footage and took 60 hours of film and boiled it down, sort of restored the footage, the audio, boiled it down to this, 8-hour, 3-part documentary, which has really changed people's views at that time and kind of became certainly the biggest cultural phenomenon in terms of a rock doc that we've seen since we've been on this beat.
Yeah. I hope I'm not a prisoner of the moment. No rock doc has ever been this much of a cultural moment.
No, I don't think so.
Right? I mean, this was like the most written about, most talked about thing since like Thanos.
Yeah.
It was
the Avengers of rock docs.
Yeah. No, I'm under no illusions that like everyone in America watched this. I know they were busy watching reruns of How I Met Your Mother, but like in the world of websites and podcasts that talk about music and pop culture stuff, this was like the biggest thing that happened in 2021.
Yeah, the discourse.
In the discourse, right? So yeah, well described. I think it is a remarkable movie, and I can't stop watching it. And I'm not necessarily saying that it is without flaws, because it's quite boring in long stretches. A lot of it is like intentionally boring, almost like a test.
Or you got to find something in there.
Well, and challenges you. And believe me, I do. I found a lot in there, but it's like, I mean, it's an 8-hour movie, and most of the time they're playing the same songs over and over again.
Right. On paper, it doesn't seem like it would work.
Yeah, no, it's not making an appeal to uninterested audiences. You wouldn't think on paper. And yet I would guess that most people would be captivated by this movie.
It certainly seems to have caught the attention of the public.
And like non-Beatles obsessives. This isn't like something that you have to already have power rankings of your 5 favorite Beatles albums to get anything out of.
Right. Yes. It's not just for the heads.
No, although the heads seem to love it quite a bit as well.
Yeah.
Because, one of the things, for instance, I'd be fair to say you count yourself as a Beatles head, right?
Let me just say that
Yes.
when I was in college, I took a class on the history of the Beatles.
Okay.
To my recollection, this is the only class in college that I got an A+ on. Not because I studied hard. I already knew this stuff. I rolled in and crushed it.
Yeah.
And that was, 20 whatever million years ago.
Yeah.
Since then, I've read many books about the Beatles, and been a bit of a Beatles head.
Yes. Okay. And so I wouldn't put myself in that category. I certainly, as somebody who likes music a lot, I've listened to the Beatles my whole life. I love the Beatles. I could go through different albums. I have opinions about all of their albums, but I'm not an obsessive. There's been a friend at every stage of my life who knew more about the Beatles than I did.
Right.
So that's where I come at this from. But
So you're the Beatles noob in this
conversation without question.
Well,
so
let me ask this: Did you have a thought or opinion about what this was going to be when you heard about it? Like, did you think what was your thought about that era, etc.?
I knew roughly the story of the turmoil of the Twickenham sessions,
right? Which was the first studio they were in when things were not great.
Yeah, and I knew that they went in the studio to record "Let It Be" first, but Abbey Road came out first,
right?
And that was like I've heard people like to trot that out as like a Beatles trivia question.
Yeah, right, exactly. Which was their last album? Oh, which one recorded or the last one to come out?
Yeah, exactly. So, but no, I didn't.
Like, did you know about Billy Preston?
Did I know about the what?
Like, did you know that Billy Preston was brought in and kind of sparked? Okay,
no, and I. It was not like, oh, finally, I'll know the circumstances around George Harrison walking away from the band.
Okay,
okay.
So you had a light understanding.
I had a light understanding that this was a pivotal moment in the last year of their existence.
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, who's the funniest Beatle?
The funniest Beatle is Ringo.
I mean, that's kind of the obvious answer, right?
Yeah. I mean, the runaway star from this movie, pun intended, is Ringo.
Absolutely. No doubt about it.
He is a sweetheart. I adore him.
Yeah.
By all accounts, everyone adores him.
Yeah.
There's like 3 or 4 moments in this movie where people just have a conversation to the side about how much they love Ringo.
Right.
It's like multiple moments in the movie.
Right. Nobody is like, Paul is the greatest guy.
No.
They might be like, he's a fabulous musician and we love hearing him play the piano.
Yeah.
But nobody is praising him as a dude.
Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director, who is in the movie a lot.
So he directed the original Let It Be footage. He was there he's there, we see him a lot in the movie, and he directed the original movie Let It Be. Mm-hmm. So he's sort of the director of the 1.0 version, Peter Jackson being the director of the 2021 version.
Yeah. So there's one moment where he's just standing there with Linda McCartney and he just says, "I love Ringo." And she goes, "Yeah, Ringo's my favorite. I feel so comfortable around Ringo."
I feel the same way, Linda.
And then like 30 minutes later, Michael Lindsay Hogg's standing next to Ringo and he just looks at him and goes, "I love you." And Ringo goes, "I love you too." It's incredible.
It's great. I mean, Ringo is incredible. He's an incredible musician.
Yeah.
I think this, anybody who has the, Ringo's not a good drummer, musician, whatever thing.
Yeah, that's a take out there.
That take is blown away by this movie.
Yeah.
Just go lock yourself in a room and watch this. Like, they're improvising all these songs and messing around, and like he's just rock solid at all times.
Yeah.
Like there's never a missed beat and the right touch at all times. Even just off the cuff, any song that's ever been recorded, created a brand new song, Paul comes up with a song, whatever, off the top of his head, boom, Ringo's right there.
This isn't related to what you just said, but when Paul's sitting there and he starts playing, I think he starts playing Let It Be initially.
Yeah.
And Ringo looks to, I think, Michael Lindsay Hogg and just goes, I could sit there and watch him do this all day. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
He's just gushing. He's so emotional about everything. It's great.
It's such a great moment because, Ringo's talking to Michael Lindsay Hogg. The camera's on them, basically.
Yeah.
Paul's in the background sitting at the piano, coming up with Let It Be.
Right. And
that's
Ringo,
just kind of, and
Ringo isn't too cool for the moment. He recognizes that he's watching
a genius
create a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And narrates the moment.
Yeah,
he says,
exactly.
I could watch this all day.
Right, but the film doesn't foreground this. Like, that just happens.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say anywhere, and now check it out. Here comes Let It Be.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
you need to be listening to be like, here, Paul kind of blinking away, and then Let It Be kind of comes out of that.
Yeah.
Which is another thing about this movie that's so rewarding is like you're watching and you're just living and hanging out with them. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden these moments of brilliance happens. I think probably the one that most people picked out is from the first so this is a three-parter. Yeah. The first part, when Paul is just strumming chords and messing around on his bass, which most bass players don't even play chords.
Right.
And he just writes Get Back.
He writes Get Back.
And you see Ringo and George are just sitting there kind of bored. They're like waiting for John to show up. Mm-hmm. And Paul's just messing around. And then you see them like slowly just kind of start to move and tap their feet. And like George eventually picks up his guitar and starts like coming up with some chords. And Ringo's just clapping. Yeah. And it becomes the Beatles playing Get Back.
Yes.
Like it happens in front of your eyes.
Yeah, I think that's the moment from this movie that most people will take away with them. That and the rooftop concert, both.
Yeah.
Which it is a remarkable moment, but there's like 8 moments like that.
Yeah.
Where you see a song just come out of them.
Yeah.
There's one late that I haven't seen many people talk about, but where Ringo says, "Have I showed you the Octopus song?"
Yeah.
And he walks over to the piano and he starts trying to play Octopus's Garden. And George Harrison just like immediately grabs his guitar and starts helping him work out the melody.
Right. Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's another thing about Ringo is like he wrote Octopus's Garden. He wrote a few songs.
Yeah.
But he's very comfortable with his role.
Yes.
Like he's not trying to push and be like, "Hey guys, listen to my song." Yeah. He's like he knows he came up with something good.
Right.
Like he's a Beatle. He has that standard.
Right.
He also doesn't try to be John Lennon or Paul McCartney. Like he's not trying to be that.
No.
He knows he's bringing the goods.
Right. So we see there's quite a bit of tension between Paul and John and Paul and George.
Right.
Especially in the first part and the first half of the second part of this movie.
Yeah.
Ringo is a bystander for most of that stuff.
Right.
And it's, I mean, I guess there are probably different interpretations about what exactly is going on, but you certainly see George grappling with the fact that he's coming into his own as a songwriter.
Right.
And it's no longer enough for him to have 2 songs an album and be the lesser songwriter of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting machine. And how do you change that in the middle of the most successful career any band's ever had?
Right. I mean, he kind of proposes. He's like, well, I kind of have a batch of songs. Like, maybe I'll just record my own album.
Yeah.
And John's like, yeah, like we could kind of do it with you and it'll be the Beatles, but it's George's songs or something. And George is like, well, maybe. And
John's
it just
really
seems like
supportive.
all the answers are obvious and they don't see them in front of their face.
Well, because no one had done it yet.
Right.
That's the thing. It's like,
but you're yelling at the screen, like, just go record an album. It's fine.
I know. But it is so, I was thinking about this the first time I watched through that section where it's like, now it is so retroactively obvious. Like, yeah, you guys can be the Beatles. You can each create your solo records. Every 2 or 3 years, get back together and do a Beatles record and tour.
Yeah.
And then go back to living your lives again.
Sure.
Like you can't maintain the productivity of the first 5 years of your career as a band anymore anyway.
Right.
But it was a new job to be a rock star.
Right.
And so there was no path to do it. There was no path to keep a band together for 40 years.
Right.
There was no path to be a successful solo artist and a successful member of a successful band.
Right.
And they didn't figure it out. They didn't do
exactly.
it.
The whole movie is them trying to figure stuff out that seems obvious.
Yes.
Even with the songs. It's like, you know how Get Back is supposed to go. You know how Let It Be is supposed to go, or Two of Us or whatever. And they're working on it, and it's like,
well, I know the song now.
Right, you're
so
like, yeah, it's Tucson, Arizona. Like, that's what the word, that's the little phrase you're looking for.
Like,
and then
the
John's
tempo's
like,
too fast.
John's
guys,
like, wait, is
down.
Tucson in Arizona? Like,
yeah.
yeah, like that's what it is. But yeah,
right.
it's Yeah. So, but Ringo.
Also to your point about things that are obvious now, it's like they're going back and forth with the narrative of putting this show together.
Right.
Throughout, especially the first 2 or 3 hours of the movie. So the idea is, okay, let's get in the studio. Ringo needs to go film a movie at the end of the month. We have a month to write these songs, break these songs, rehearse these songs, record these songs, have a concert. At the end, we'll have an album, we'll have a TV special from the concert, and we'll have a documentary about the making of this whole thing.
Right.
And they have this plan and this totally self-imposed deadline to do it in a month, which is creating all kinds of stress,
right.
even though it's completely arbitrary.
Right.
And it's
because Ringo is going to star in some movie that nobody remembers.
That, like, one phone call to the director. It's like,
right.
Hey, we just remembered, fuck you, we're the Beatles.
We just came up with, she came in through the bathroom window, so we're going to do that instead.
Yeah. Hey, asshole, have you ever heard of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? That was us. Wait. So they hem and haw throughout for hours about where to have the concert. Do they need to have a concert? Should we go through with the plan that was our idea?
Right.
Or do we not? Who's going to be left holding the bag? The Michael Lindsay Hogg very, very much wants them to go to Africa to do this concert.
Tripoli.
Tripoli.
Some amphitheater at dawn.
Yes, and to play to 2,000 Arabs.
Right. And then they're like, well, no, we could just ship in a bunch of English people. It's like, why are you doing this?
Like, guys, it's so overly complicated. And then at the very end, they start to abandon in the final days, like the last day, they consider maybe not even having the rooftop concert.
Yeah.
And it's Paul who's been the one that demanded to have it all culminate into a show.
Right.
Who suddenly is unable to articulate why he doesn't like the idea anymore.
Right.
And there's this one moment where Paul grabs a piece of paper and he's like, all right, well, let's go through the numbers. What do we have?
Right.
And the whole time I'm sitting there going, why don't they just get a piece of paper and write out a set list?
Yeah.
If it's 5 songs, it's 5 songs.
Right. Well, the other thing that's never said is, like, if they have 5 songs and they want to do this concert, guess what? They could also sing "I Want to Hold Your Hand." They know that one.
You know the old ones, right? Like, yeah, sure. There's some of the
Yesterday.
Yeah, there's some complicated stuff from the White Album that they're not going to be able to play live.
Right.
It's fine. You have 100 songs. You're the Beatles.
Right.
People have played concerts.
It never occurs to them.
Yeah. There is something in this movie
to play back in the USSR.
And this is an amazing part of this too, because this is all part of it. Their inability to figure out how to have a concert,
right?
But at the same time, like, they can't record anything. They don't have an 8-track.
Well, okay, that's a whole nother. Okay,
there's all this stuff, and it's like
a running thing going through this movie is that they don't have the equipment. They're borrowing stuff from George. They're kind of hacking things together. They, like, yeah, and they're kind of complaining about the record company EMI.
And
it's like, does Ian?
George is like, who's going to pay for all that? George keeps being like an accountant who's worried about who's going to pay for their ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, you are the Beatles. You are the most powerful people in popular culture at this moment. There will be money if you want to do something.
Exactly, but
it's like
I'm dying to hear the story from EMI, the record company.
What's that?
I'm dying to hear the story from EMI, the record company.
Right.
Because, like, did they not realize that they have this money machine?
Right.
And, I mean, I guess they couldn't have foreseen that, like, 60 years later,
you're still going to be...
they'd still be printing money
more
than
up
ever.
With some new concept of how to
But even in the short term, it seems like, hey, the Beatles are recording an album. Let's get them all the equipment that they need so that they can record an album and we will sell millions of copies.
Like the Grateful Dead at this point, at exactly this moment.
Yes.
This is not even a hypothetical. At the time of this, the Grateful Dead, who are playing like concerts to no one.
Right. Nobody's ever heard of them.
And they're selling 0 records.
Right.
And they're recording on a 16-track.
Right.
And the Beatles need to borrow George Harrison's recording equipment
Right.
to put together Let It Be?
Yeah.
It's madness to me. And it's like my only guess is that the industry was so immature and we're still in the like take advantage of artists for everything that they're worth.
Right.
Rip the publishing from them.
Right.
Give them pennies on every record sale and nothing else. That they don't realize that they have the power.
Right.
It's like before the player empowerment era of sports.
Right.
Like they don't realize that there haven't been musician prima donnas yet. And so they don't realize that they can just be like, fine, fuck you. You guys can't make a record. So if we don't make a record, you won't be able to sell a record.
Right. You're not going to make all that money.
Yeah.
Well, the problem, I think, is that their manager, Mr. Epstein, Brian Epstein, who they call Mr. Epstein,
Who's like 5 years older
right,
than them.
had died a year or two earlier, and they were without a manager, and they clearly need management.
Yes.
Like, this is the most needing management of all time. Like, people, they're not passive aggressive. They're not really passive.
There is one incredibly passive aggressive moment when Paul says to George, I can hear myself annoying you. And George says, you don't ignore me anymore. It's like artistically passive aggressive.
I wanted to get back to say that I think George is the funniest Beatle.
Yeah, George is pretty funny. Yeah.
He drops a joke in once an hour in this movie, and it's a good one.
Yes.
And but yeah, for the most part, they're like polite to each other, polite to everybody. They
are incredibly polite to each other, and all the other people in their orbit, their management, the roadies, Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director, Glenn Johns, they're incredibly polite to everyone.
Yeah.
They all come across as very sweet, good boys.
Yeah. Is this a trilogy in the Peter Jackson universe?
Let's put a pin in that. I have a take there.
Okay.
But I want to say to your point about two things to say on the management front. One, and again, you have read the histories more than I have.
Sure.
It seems very much like part of the tension here is that in the absence of management, Paul is beginning to assert himself as the manager.
Right.
And that's not going over well with John and George.
Right.
Yeah. And then also in the final part of the movie, they begin having meetings, first John with Alan Klein.
Right.
And it's never said in the movie, but that is more of a precipitating event to their breakup than just about anything else.
Yeah.
When they
Alan
finally sign
Klein
Alan
ends
Klein.
up being toxic and a bad situation.
Yes.
But yeah.
And John eventually admits that Paul was right about that.
Yeah, of course. But that's years later. I mean,
Right.
that's not... This movie doesn't tell you any of that.
No, but it's there. It is
Right.
in there.
The interesting thing about this movie also is that, like, it starts out with like a 10-minute intro about the Beatles. So you see them getting together and then they're on the Ed Sullivan Show, whatever. But then when this movie ends, they don't tell you what happens after that.
Also, the first time I watched it, and I think I had sort of forgotten what the scope of the movie was. And so I sit down and I turn it on, and my heart started racing because I was like, what are they doing? They're all the way through the White Album, and it's been 1.5 minutes. like, slow down. What is going on?
You're watching the Beatles anthology on like super fast forward.
Yeah, what is going on with this documentary? Okay, so those are my two management points.
Okay. Peter Jackson.
Peter Jackson.
Is this a trilogy in the Peter Jackson cinematic universe? Let's just talk about the whole Peter Jackson situation.
Okay, so I think it is, and this is the closest thing I have to a take here.
Okay.
I think this movie is incredibly similar and goes on the shelf perfectly as a Peter Jackson joint alongside Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
I think this is just like Lord of the Rings.
Okay. Let's hear it.
The reason I think that is he recognizes in both of these that his asset is the source material. What he's working with is something that is beloved, that people come to with in the case of Lord of the Rings, this childhood attachment. In the case of the Beatles, like a lifelong attachment.
Right.
And so it's a rare subject that people will give you their time for.
Right.
People will give you however much time you want. And so you can tell the story knowing that you don't need to convince them. You don't need to hook them. They're already hooked.
Right.
And so you can use that to your advantage and tell the story in a completely different way. And you can watch them play a snippet of Get Back 67 times in the course of this movie. You can have a conversation end and just keep the camera on the 6 people that were part of the conversation looking at each other awkwardly because they don't know what to do for 45 seconds.
Right.
You know, it's using the subject matter as part of how you tell the story.
Right.
So that's the biggest reason. The second biggest reason is using technological advancement not just to show off the fact that you have a new technology, but to actually say, what can I do with this movie based on the technology that I couldn't do with this movie if not for the technology?
Right. So I think a lot of people watching, that hadn't really read a lot about it probably would not know what that is. Mm-hmm. So the footage was filmed in 16 millimeter. And it's 60 years old and had been sitting in a vault. And there was 150 hours of audio to go along with it. And Peter Jackson's team in New Zealand took that, for sort of frame by frame and cleaned it up, blew it up to basically 35 millimeter HD. And then sort of added this digital grain to make it seem like a 35 millimeter film. So, it looks similar in terms of the visuals, or at least the intention is to make it look similar to, a feature film, like let's say The Graduate or something, right? Like a contemporaneous 35 millimeter Hollywood type of movie, right? Sometimes it looks a little weird. There are moments in the film that, the digital artifact situation can look a little funky if you're kind of noticing what's going on in the background. They also cleaned up the audio, which I think was, in some sense, more important and has been talked about a lot less. So there's film nerds on Twitter complaining about the 35 millimeter, version and like what they did to the digital, et cetera. Okay, cool, whatever.
Yeah.
It's not that I disagree, but it's a take. But nobody's complaining about the audio because it is awesome.
Yeah. So the way I listened to an interview with the editor of this film, and he explained what they did technologically with the audio, which is much of the audio was previously unusable because it was all recorded in mono. And they're in this big sound stage.
Right.
With a mono recording that might have 6 different conversations happening in the room at the same time.
Right.
And Paul tuning his bass and Ringo working on playing the drums and people walking around.
Right.
And so you can't actually hear anything. And so you can't use any of those audio segments. And sometimes it's even inaudible.
Right.
So not only you couldn't use it for your film, you wouldn't even know what they're saying if you could, if you wanted to. And so they used machine learning and basically isolated the moments that you could hear Paul and told the computer, that's Paul.
Yeah.
Anytime you hear anything, listen for Paul and pull that out.
Right.
And make that its own track.
Okay.
And then do the same for George and do the same for Mal and do the same for George Martin and do the same for Yoko. And so they used machine learning to take a mono recording and turn it into a 16-track recording, basically.
Right.
So that then you can cut out all the stuff that you don't want to listen to at any given time.
And if they're having a dialogue, you can push up George and then you can pull down Ringo, whatever.
Right. Which is remarkable. And this movie is a conversation. It's like
right. I think the point about this is like when 20 years ago when everyone went to see Lord of the Rings, it was like this is an incredible technical achievement.
Yes.
Right. And I feel like nowadays, because special effects, everything has been done. The like era of going to a movie or watching a movie and thinking like, wow, this is an amazing technical achievement is kind of over because we've seen it all. We've seen the Avengers and all this stuff.
And also they like look boring now.
Yeah, it's all just kind of the same.
Yeah.
But this movie, Get Back, is a remarkable technical achievement.
Yes.
And it deserves to be, for better or worse, recognized for that.
Yes.
And the Beatles were, like, if you're going to do about anybody, it's the Beatles, because they were always on the cutting edge of technology and pushing what you could artistically express using whatever technology was out there at the time.
And to my point about it being not just technology for the sake of using the newest and coolest toy,
right?
And actually asking, well, what story can I tell now, or how can I tell this story in a way that you couldn't before? Peter Jackson had a fantastic interview on the Mark Maron podcast. Mark Maron is basically at this point like fantastic supplemental listening for any rock doc devotee.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, when you've done with Rock Docs episodes,
go listen.
Maybe check out Mark Maron. Yeah, he's got a podcast.
He's got a little thing he's working on. But he said, both on the audio and the video, he said what was so important. He knew that there were going to be the film Twitter nerds you're talking about that were complaining about the grain, removing the grain from the video.
Right, 16.
That they wanted the grain, right?
Right. They wanted to look like the original 16 millimeter footage.
And what he was saying is having that removes the fly on the wall component of this movie. That it feels like you're just in the room with the Beatles because it doesn't look like found footage from this moment.
Right.
And if it was grainy, it would look like, oh, I'm watching a 50-year-old film.
Right.
And so it would take you out of the moment, that it would build a wall between you and the guys. And the reason there is no wall is because the footage looks so modern, almost.
Right.
And then I think the audio portion is sort of self-explanatory. You can't hear these personal conversations unless you can play with the audio the way they have.
Yeah. So.
And he also said just last bit is that he decided early on, because he wanted to have that fly on the wall and he didn't want to have any sort of 50-year retrospective. What I thought at the moment was X, but now I realize 50 years later that George was just feeling this, that, or the other thing. That's why he decided not to have contemporaneous interviews with Paul, contemporaneous interviews with Ringo, historians jumping in to opine and provide context. Dave Grohl, Questlove. Right.
Yeah, it's all like every single frame that you see in this movie existed in 1969.
Yes.
Or before. Right.
And so he said altogether, all of that was necessary. That you could only feel like you were in the studio with those guys if you did all of those things, because then you're almost able to forget that you're watching something that happened 50 years ago.
So another thing that strikes me is that we are 30-some minutes into a conversation about a Beatles movie.
Yeah.
And there's one name that we've barely mentioned.
Yeah.
John Lennon.
Well, he's barely in the first 3 hours.
That's true.
I mean, well, he's in it all, but he just doesn't say a word.
He is perhaps using heroin. I'm just going to go out there and say.
It seems like
a person who is using heroin or struggling with heroin.
It does seem that way, yes. I think...
When I was growing up,
yeah.
I'm assuming when you were growing up,
yeah,
the Beatles, the whole thing was about John Lennon. It was all you heard about was John Lennon.
Yeah, it was like Paul's like...
Everybody knew he was the genius. He just recently,
John's
in the last 10 years, gotten
the
shot.
Artistic genius, and Paul's the lovable golden retriever.
Yeah, and then eventually, like, the George Harrison hipsters came along.
And said, like, actually, he's the best.
Right, yeah, and that was just kind of the narrative. But it was like, imagine John Lennon, like, the whole thing was just, he was sainted.
Yes.
And it was his band, which
he
was the founder of the band.
He had the political views that were ahead of their time.
Right.
And, Paul was so apolitical, or seemed to be. Now, I think that had... As I've gotten older, I feel like fewer and fewer people have put forward those sorts of ideas lately, I think. Mm-hmm. But I do think that this movie sort of quashes whatever is left of that idea.
Right.
But I've seen people say that John comes off looking bad in this movie.
Yeah.
I've seen people say that Paul comes off looking bad in this movie.
Sure.
I've seen people say that George comes off looking bad in this
Sure.
movie. I've not heard anybody say that Ringo comes off looking bad in this movie. And if you said that, bring yourself to me.
Take those words right out of your mouth.
I'm going to have Ringo fart on you, which is also something he does in this movie.
That's true. You were there with these people for like weeks.
Yeah, of course they fart at some point. But so I don't know. There's sort of just like the idea of having like your favorite Beatle. There's sort of a Rorschach test to who you think comes off looking bad.
Yeah.
Like, is Paul being too bossy? Is Paul being too much of like a teacher's pet guy? And is John being the tortured genius? Right. My hot take is that they all come out great.
Yeah.
I don't know what
John comes a little slow out of the gate,
but then he comes out looking great towards the end, right?
Yeah.
When about halfway through the second part, when he starts to like get locked in a little bit more, and him and Paul start making each other laugh, and John really starts adding some creative elements to the songs that they've gotten most of the way through writing, but they can't finish them. And John really starts to add a lot to completing the work.
Yeah.
He's great. You totally understand how most of my life it was the Beatles were John Lennon's band.
I mean, he's a great guy in a band.
Yeah.
Like, he's not the world's greatest guitar player. He doesn't have the biggest singing range. Mm-hmm. You know, whatever. But
both of which he seems pretty willing to openly acknowledge.
Yeah,
throughout this.
Yeah, there's parts where he's like, that harmony is too high for me.
Yeah.
Why am I playing the solo, not George?
Exactly.
But yeah, he's always doing bits.
He is always doing bits, and the other guys find them hysterical.
Yes. According to the rest of them, John must have been the funniest.
Yeah, but I
don't think his humor I just don't think his humor. It's kind of like listening to a comedian from the 60s. It's like at the time it was hilarious, and you listen now, you're like, well, okay, I kind of see it, but I'm not actually laughing.
Yes. The conversation, the sort of fight that John and Paul, that fight's not the right word. The hidden mic conversation that Paul and John have.
Right.
Do you have a hard time keeping the thread of what exactly it is that they're discussing in that part?
Yeah. So, I mean, what happens is George at one point walks out, and it sort of seems like maybe he's leaving the band. It's not really clear. It seems like he had trouble at home, and he just left.
Which is something Peter Jackson has said after the fact, that he had a lot of problems going on with his wife at the time, and they didn't really want to get into that.
Yeah. So, so then the rest of them are just hanging out. They clock in for work.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that George is
one of the four Beatles has said he's not part of the band anymore. And they all show up and
sitting around on chairs looking at each other like, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
But yeah, there's one point where John and Paul have a conversation in a room, and the director had hidden a mic. It seems like the movie makes it seem like it was in a flower pot. I'm not exactly sure, but that's cute.
Yeah.
And they were able to reconstruct this audio, and you hear this discussion between Paul and John, but they're really not. Neither of them is listening to what the other is saying. It's really hard to follow the thread because they're just both talking.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've watched that scene 3 or 4 times now, and I would have a hard time writing a synopsis of like what the fight is.
Right. Like Paul says to John,
except in the broadest terms.
Yeah.
Paul
says to John, well, you were always the boss, and then I was the second boss.
Yeah.
And it's like, does that mean he's saying he's really the boss? He's the guy behind the guy?
Yeah.
Like, or is he trying to tell John, like, you're supposed to be the boss? Like, go get George and get him back in gear. Let's go. Let's do this. Like, what? Right. Like, he's asking John. It's not really clear.
No. He says to, prior to that, I think it's prior to that, he says to John basically like, hey, you're not bringing any songs?
Yeah.
Like, we could use some songs. And John, just guy after my own heart, I fucking love him. He yawns and says, I think, Paul, you'll see I'm at my best when I'm up against the wall.
Like, they don't know each other.
Yeah. like 10 years, almost 10 years into their career at this point. He's like talking to a college professor. He's like,
trust me,
I'll finish the term paper. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it always seems to get done.
Well, it's interesting. I was reading recently Little Steven's book.
Yeah.
And he's talking about the Beatles. And he's going on about saying that a point that people forget about the Beatles is they got together in 1956.
Yeah.
Everybody in the world knew them by 63, 64. They broke up in 70. So basically they had 2 careers.
Yeah.
And we only saw the second half. Literally they were halfway through their career when they showed up on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the end of it in this movie, or right near the end. But they had a whole life, people are like, look at the Beatles. They only lasted 7 years, and look at what they do. It's like, no, they lasted 14 years.
Yeah,
That's a pretty long time for a band or a group of people, especially when you get together when you're like 14 years old.
Right.
And so there's a lot of, if you look at it and you watch this movie, you're like, well, hey, just a couple years ago they were doing this, and why aren't they getting along or communicating? It's like, they're like 28 or 29, and they've been together since they were 13, 14.
Yeah.
That's a lot of history built up there.
Well, and that is something that I find myself thinking about a lot when I watch this is it's the end, and it feels so late in their career, and Epstein has died.
Right.
Their band has experienced the tragedy of death.
Right.
Their multiple divorces are in the band.
Sure.
Already or are playing out.
Right.
They have kids, right? They're fighting about their record deal, and they're creating all this stuff, and they're in their late 20s. Mm-hmm. It's wild.
Yeah, they're kids.
They're absolute kids, but they have had a whole life.
Yeah. It's, when you put that all together, it's like when they're not communicating, it's like, well, I don't know that I communicated that well with anybody.
When I was 28 years old.
I'm 45, and I'm struggling to communicate on this podcast right now. But, it's, so about halfway through the movie is the big pivot, which is when Billy Preston comes in. So the whole thing with Billy Preston is he's a keyboard player, African-American guy from, America. They knew him from when they played together in Hamburg in 1960 when he played with Little Richard. This whole first half of this Get Back movie, George keeps trying to bring other people into the Beatles. Yeah. You got Bob Dylan, he's trying to bring him in. Eric Clapton. He's just like, I cannot play guitar solos like that. Let's get Eric Clapton in here. Yeah. In retrospect, I'm glad they did not do that.
Yes.
That
is one of my favorite parts in the movie is when George Harrison is speaking reverently about the way Clapton plays guitar.
Yeah.
He's basically just describing improvisational guitar.
Right, exactly.
That he starts playing this way and he doesn't really know where it's going to go, but it always resolves itself and it tells us full coherent picture.
Yeah.
And Paul just smoking a thin cigar just casually says, yeah, jazz. just like couldn't be less impressed. Just like, right. Jazz exists, George. I've heard of it.
But so basically the people that he's trying to get into the Beatles, which seems absurd, are Bob Dylan, big name, Eric Clapton, big name, and Billy Preston, who nobody's heard of.
Yes. Tell me his case again for Billy Preston. He's basically like, even Ray Charles doesn't try to play the way Billy Preston plays. He just lets Billy do it, basically.
Right. He's like, yeah, exactly. And somehow Billy Preston shows up. They don't really explain. It's not exactly explained how that happens.
Kind of seems like maybe they fudged it a little bit.
Maybe.
Like he was, I think said he was like on a movie set or something, or a TV set.
He was
TV. It was like a TV recording.
Yeah.
And he comes by to say hi.
Yeah.
And they're like, do you want to play?
Yeah. We have this electric piano sitting here. And he walks in, and immediately the entire band is like, hell yeah.
Hell yes.
We found our sound. This is it.
No one more than John Lennon. That's like
really
when John Lennon comes to life.
John Lennon is so sprung for this whole situation.
Yeah.
It's awesome. And he's not wrong.
I have like a get up out of my couch and cheer moment.
Yes.
When John Lennon's like, Billy, you're really giving us a lift.
It is so, and it's true.
Like, punch my fists in the air. It's like he is giving them a lift.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
He's a phenomenal musician.
Yes.
And
I mean, the musically the best parts of this are when he's playing with them and you hear the songs come together and his
not the actual song come together.
Right. And his keys are just beautiful.
Yeah. He's like Ringo, he plays everything right all the time.
Yes.
Never makes a mistake.
George Martin even says at one point they're like listening to a track to see if they got it right. And Billy very self-consciously says, was mine okay? And George Martin laughs and he's like, Bill, you were perfect. Don't worry, Bill.
Right. George Martin is like used to working with like the London Philharmonic. Yeah. That's like the caliber of musicians he's used to working with, and Billy Preston is up there.
Yeah.
Billy Preston also, by virtue of this movie, I'm willing to say, is the chillest dude ever.
Yes.
Like he makes Ringo seem high strung.
He is so chill. He's like getting a kick out of the whole thing, happy to be there. At least from what we see on he doesn't seem to expect that like he's going to have creative input.
No.
He's there to play the songs the way they want to play them perfectly.
Yeah.
You know?
The first time
to teach George
music theory
music theory multiple times, and George is like into it too. George is like, Billy, what's this? And Billy's like, oh, let me see what you're doing. Oh yeah, he's like, oh, it's a
you're adding a C to an E chord. What is that?
Yeah,
like, that's an augmented fifth weather.
Yeah.
And it's he's totally
laughing.
chill with it.
He's just ripping cigarettes.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
A
lot of smoking.
There's a lot of smoking across the movie, but none more than Billy.
Yeah,
I think
at all times he's got one rolling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just chill dude. And then he keeps hanging out. And at one point, the Beatles are all talking to each other like, are we supposed to pay him? How does this work?
How does this work? And John's like, I would like him to be in the band. Like, and as if they don't know exactly what I mean. He's like the fifth Beatle. Like, I'd like him to be that. And
then Paul responds, listen, it's hard enough with four of us.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. He does say that. And that's when George says like we could bring Dylan in too.
Yeah, George is like we open the floodgates.
Like we should be like the polyphonic spree.
Right, just bringing people in left and right.
Who else do we know?
Which is like it seems crazy, but it's also like who's to say? Like why not have the other people in the Beatles? Like it's nowadays.
Now it's insane.
It's like adding somebody to Mount Rushmore. But at the time, it was like, why not? You know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, even when George leaves, he's like, just get a replacement. Like he doesn't treat it as like,
right,
I'm leaving the band and therefore there is no band. He's like,
right,
there's other people who play guitar. Go. And even John's like, I guess we'll have to get Eric Clapton then.
Yeah, that's all they talk about. Like, and it's funny. Like, I just kind of feel like, was there a moment where they're like, how about that Jimmy Page guy? He's trying to. He was in the Yardbirds. It doesn't seem to have worked out, but he's trying to get this other band together. Maybe I'm really interested. I always want to know. I've wanted to know this forever. Like, was there ever a conversation or even a thought of a list of potential lead guitar players?
Yeah, Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, sure.
He's fucking around in London at this point, right?
Yeah.
Or I guess
he was
a little
probably
bit after that.
Yeah, he was already like a big star.
He was a big star by this point. Yeah.
I mean, why not?
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like Jimmy Page was probably on the tip of people's tongue.
Yeah.
And somehow it didn't happen. I mean, 69, I guess Zeppelin had already recorded their first album with Glenn Johns. Right. We have a lot of people to talk about. There's a lot of people in this movie we've not mentioned their names.
Yes.
But let's just run down some names. Glenn Johns.
So of all the...
He's the recording engineer.
He's the recording engineer, but like is much more involved in the music than George Martin.
Right.
From what we see here.
Yeah, George Martin's barely involved.
He gets more involved towards the end.
Right.
But early on, especially when they're rehearsing, Glenn Johns is giving them ideas about how to complete these songs in ways that George Martin is not.
Yes.
And so throughout the movie, I'm sort of thinking often about how things play out for these people after this moment.
Right.
And some of them experience tragedy.
Right.
Mal has a very tragic story.
Right. Mal Evans is like the Beatles assistant / puppy dog / guy who's just happy to be there.
Yeah, he comes across great in this movie.
Yeah.
But We can get into it if you'd like. He has a very sad end of his life, not much longer than after this. But I don't think anyone has a sadder period after this movie than Glenn Johns, because just 2 years after sharing the studio with the Beatles, he has to produce the Eagles' first record.
Oof. Brutal.
Just, can you imagine being in the studio for this and then 2 years later being like, what? I have to produce this cheap Crosby, Stills and Nash knockoff bullshit?
Well, let's start with if I'm getting my timeline right, which I think I am, right before this, he recorded in like a couple days the first Led Zeppelin album and produced it, which then Jimmy Page took production credit away from him. Mm-hmm. So he's dealing with that. Then he gets to like hang out with the Beatles for a month and record their album. Yeah, and then he's, the Eagles.
And then the Eagles.
Bummer.
He did like Steve Miller, I believe.
No, he did a bunch of stuff.
He did a bunch of stuff, yeah. Billy Preston. He did a bunch of Billy Preston solo records.
But Glenn Johns, his fashion choices. The fashion in this movie is, this is a podcast, so it's a little hard to get into that, but boy.
Glenn Johns rocking some serious eyewear.
Yes.
Some serious fur coats.
Yeah.
George Harrison also, some fantastic fashion choices.
But you know who Glenn Johns was giving me vibes of in terms of look is Joel Guion.
Yes.
From Brian Jones Sound Massacre from Dig.
The oversized sunglasses.
Yeah, the big buggy sunglasses.
Are very Joel Guion.
Yeah. Joel Guion bit his whole style from Glenn Johns. I'm calling it now.
Yes. Okay, that's good. So Glenn Johns comes out. He's really into these guys, and these guys are really into him. They really respect him. They listen to him. They fuck with him a little bit.
Yeah,
but they get along with him.
They call him Glennis.
He does not have a high opinion of Alan Klein. Tries to warn John Lennon, who is enamored of Alan Klein.
So perhaps they should have just listened to Glenn Johns a little bit more.
Yeah, Glenn Johns, by the way, should have listened to himself. He famously, in the History of the Eagles documentary, says that the first time he listened to the Eagles, he said, "I don't really understand the big deal. These guys kind of fucking suck."
We'll get there.
Maybe should have listened to that first impression.
But we did get the History of the Eagles documentary, which on its own
thank God. Yes. And Glenn Johns is fantastic in that as well.
Related, there's just a little clips of Alan Parsons.
Yes.
Who's like the assistant recording engineer.
Tape manager.
Tape manager. Alan Parsons went on to produce Dark Side of the Moon.
Yes.
And became a big star himself with the Alan Parsons Project, Eye in the Sky. Yeah. Go look that up, kids. It's popular in the early 80s. But yeah, we've got a lot of people we haven't even really gotten into. Let's just get into the big names. Yoko Ono.
So it was interesting about this movie. It was such a moment, and I think pretty well timed that its drop was on that Thanksgiving, 4-day Thanksgiving weekend. And so like my Twitter feed was watching it and tweeting live. And in retrospect, people were mostly live tweeting the first part. I think a lot of those people maybe didn't make it all the way through. But like one thing that was a common topic was how bizarre it was to see Yoko just sort of sitting there next to John silently.
Right. Whenever there's John in this movie, there is Yoko.
Right next to him.
Yes.
But I'll say again, I think she comes across really well in this movie too.
Yeah.
I think she comes across great. One thing you definitely don't get the impression of is that she broke up the Beatles.
No.
Which I know the history books have already dispelled that notion.
Right.
That this movie didn't need to do that.
Right.
But if you didn't trust those books or whatever it was, we have documentary evidence here. They all seem to like her. They get along with her well. Her and Paul have like a little bit of a rapport with one another.
Yeah.
There's fantastic little footage that has no sound when they start to get along pretty well with her and Linda chatting and hanging out
Dying
together.
to hear what they were talking about.
God, yes.
Linda comes across great, but Yoko, the thing about it is that like John is not looking good. Like especially in the very beginning, of this movie, he kind of seems to get his act together, but in the beginning, he's strung out,
sucked out, drawn in.
Yeah, and just really, he needs that support.
Yes.
And one way or the other, Yoko is providing that to him. And, like, I don't know that he would even be able to be there or accomplish anything without that support. And so if he's an artist and he's John Lennon and he's like, hey, this is what I need, this is who I want to be around me so that I can produce the art I'm going to produce, it doesn't seem to be hurting anybody else. And, like, he got it done, and she's pretty chill.
3 great Yoko moments in this movie.
Yeah.
One, Michael Lindsay Hogg comes to Paul at one point to discuss different ideas for the stage setup for this concert. And Paul sort of throws off a couple ideas and then basically just says, ask John and Yoko, they're the artists.
Right.
Just sort of recognizes and defers right away. Like, those two people have an eye and an understanding for this in a way that I do not.
Right.
And he's happy to defer them. Love that moment. Another moment, they decide they're going to go see George.
Right.
And Paul starts to get bucked up. He's like, let's go see George. Him and John have sorted out their problems. He says, let's go see George. And maybe it's Linda, maybe it's somebody else says, oh, he's gone back to Liverpool. And you see, like, the color drain out of Paul's face. Like, wait, he left town? Like, this might really be meaningful. And then somebody says, well, he'll be back on Wednesday. And Yoko, Johnny on the spot, just says, well, then we'll go see him Wednesday, Paul. It's fine.
Yeah.
Like, calm down, man. It's 2 days. We'll see him on Wednesday. It's okay. And Paul, like, needs it. And Paul immediately responds, okay, all right, we'll see him on Wednesday. Let's get back to work. And then the third one is they are in the middle of a rendition of, I don't remember which song, and you see Yoko just grab John and start kissing him and whispers something to him, and John says her divorce just went through.
Oh yeah, right.
And everybody's really happy, and Paul starts dancing, and John like starts going crazy on the guitar. It's a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
You, like, really see how much they love each other and how happy the other guys are for it. So
there's not one moment in this film, and I don't think it's because Peter, like, skillfully edited it out, where any of the people, especially the other 3 Beatles, have any negative feeling about Yoko at all.
No. Now, I will say that there is that conversation when John is late, and Paul says, "Look, I love Yoko. I see no problem with Yoko. But if it came down to it, and John had to choose between Yoko or the Beatles, he would choose Yoko." And it sort of comes out of nowhere, but the fact that they're having that conversation at all seems to suggest that his relationship with Yoko and the direction of his life was a conversation about how much he wanted to be in the band anymore. Not to say that she was breaking them up, not to say that she was the reason for any of their turmoil, but, like, they're openly saying they have a conversation about whether he would choose Yoko or them.
Right.
They have that conversation.
And the irony is that, like, and not in a bad way, Paul was totally attached to Linda for her entire life.
Without question.
And did tons of music with her. She was in Wings. Like, despite a lot of people, having whatever reaction they had about that, the same thing. It wasn't like Paul was some guy who, like, left his chick at home and, like, got to work and did the rock and roll. Like, Linda was there the whole time.
She's there the whole
hanging
movie
out,
too,
taking pictures.
They're both here the whole movie, and no one talks about it. But I would imagine Paul would say, I mean, if I had to choose, like, I guess the question is, like, why are we even discussing whether John would have to choose Yoko or the Beatles?
Yeah, exactly.
Why would anybody have to make that decision? Also, they do have some early versions of some of the songs that ended up on Ram with Paul and Linda.
Sure. Yeah. There's a lot of early versions of stuff that ended up being on Beatles,
solo
albums.
records. Yeah.
All right. So I guess, a lot of people have been saying, like, this is like 8-hour movie? Are you going to do an 8-hour podcast? But I think, we're trying to avoid a lot of the stuff that, at least some of the stuff that, has been, sort of wrung out in the culture about this movie.
Yeah.
But the thing, the kind of last big point I wanted to bring up was, prior to this movie coming out, if you ask some music fan, whoever, what's your picture of the Beatles? Like, just visual image of the Beatles. It could kind of vary.
Yeah.
It could be the Sgt. Pepper, or it could be them in their suits performing on the Ed Sullivan Show, or all, different images, crossing Abbey Road. These are the iconic images. Like, do you think that this is going to be the enduring image of the Beatles?
I do. I think so. And in one minor way, it's great because how fucking cool does Paul McCartney look with that beard?
He looks good.
No one has ever looked quite so cool in a beard as Paul McCartney.
No.
Man, he's awesome. No, I think it will. And I think it'll, for people of our parents' generation who had a favorite Beatle when Ed Sullivan Show was on TV, they'll have their own picture of the Beatles.
Right.
That'll be a complex collage of their whole career.
Yeah.
Or at least the whole career that played out in public after 63. But I think for people of our generation, this will be the enduring image of the Beatles. This of their relationship, of how they interacted with each other. It won't be the sort of prankster goofiness of the early Beatles.
Right.
It'll be this
the
serious,
Hard Day's Night jokey. Yeah.
Yeah. It'll be this, not Yellow Submarine. It'll be these serious guys dealing with, like, even though they're only 28, basically like midlife.
Right.
Yeah.
And getting along and yeah, I mean, the whole image that had been presented of the Beatles in their late period was like, there were 4 solo artists. They begrudgingly played on each other's songs. That's not... Maybe that was true during the White Album.
Yeah.
The year before.
Right.
But January 69, which is not that much longer.
Yeah.
After that, they're loving each other's music and just so into it.
Yeah. There's a weird bittersweet taste to the movie because the whole second half of the movie, they're cracking each other up. They are like really into these songs, they
collaborating.
They're collaborating fully. Even George, when George gets back in the room, George is suddenly having a lot of fun.
Yeah,
he's talking about his solo career with John, and John's really encouraging him.
Once he's back in, he's in,
right? And like you said, there's no postscript to the movie,
right?
And you're watching it, and it's like, oh, these guys love each other again. Yeah. These guys are getting creative energy from each other. This is going to last for a while longer. But because you know the history, that it doesn't.
Right.
That this is the end anyway. And so it's, in some ways, it complicates the story of the end of the Beatles. But in other ways, it's just like, oh, okay, it turns out like the Twickenham thing didn't have anything to do with the end of the Beatles.
Right.
But
yeah, just in terms of this being the enduring image, like we've been living with this, for a couple of months now, watching this.
Mm-hmm.
And randomly today on Twitter, like I saw a picture of Paul McCartney like today.
Yeah.
And it was shocking. Not that he looks bad for like 79 or whatever. He looks great.
Yeah.
But I've been looking at this 28-year-old man for the last 3 months or whatever.
With an incredibly handsome beard.
With a great beard. And all of a sudden, boom, I watched him age 50 years in 1 second in front of my eye. And it really was, a shocking moment.
Yeah.
And boy, the choice not to have them now being talking heads, like old Paul, old Ringo, much as I love them, like get them, like the Paul McCartney 3-2-1 thing that he did last year with Rick Rubin, this 3-part document or 5-part or whatever it was thing on Hulu, which was fabulous and I loved it. But that's a totally different thing. But yeah, just the choice that Peter Jackson made was just to keep it contemporary in 1969. Could not have been a better choice.
No, it's fantastic.
I think, and we named this our rock doc of the year for 2021. The other one being The Velvet Underground, number 2, and it's also the same thing. Like you only, I mean, you get contemporary interviews with John Cale and Maureen Tucker and people, but it still really focuses on the time. It doesn't have the like contemporary people commenting on, things from the past that they weren't there for. And I think that's a little bit of a lesson for the rock doc industrial complex that we talk about so much.
Yeah, and I mean, Peter Jackson has, he said in the Maron interview, he thought it was incumbent on him to like correct the record.
Right.
That all the books on this period say these guys couldn't fucking stand each other. It was painful for them to even be in the same room with each other. When they weren't playing, they didn't speak. And that as soon as he started looking at the footage, he was just like, oh, it's all wrong.
Yeah.
Every book that's ever been written on this period is incorrect.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And he even talks about that he was in contact with Paul and Ringo to sort of ask for more context. And he asked Ringo about when George left. And Ringo's memory was wrong.
Right.
Ringo thought George got in a fight with Paul and stormed off. And that, as we see here, that's not how it happened. They get in a fight, and then 3 days later, after a pretty minor little exchange, he leaves.
Yeah.
But the fight had happened 3 days before that.
Yeah. I mean, I saw an interview with Peter Jackson today I was watching where he was talking about how Paul also had completely different views of this time period.
Yeah.
And he just remembered it being really acrimonious.
Yeah.
And when he...
I mean, it's not acrimonious.
I guess
crazy.
Paul, while Peter Jackson was like in the process of editing this film, Paul played a concert in New Zealand, and Peter went backstage and like brought an iPad with like little clips, and he's like, "No, this is what we're getting here." And he said Paul's like face lit up and was like, "Oh my God, really? This is what we were like?"
Yeah.
Like, so even the people that were there, did not have an accurate memory. And I think this really, this really redeems it. And, it just reminds me of there's a great, as somebody who's read a lot of books about the Beatles, one book that I would really recommend is by Rob Sheffield. It's called Dreaming the Beatles. It's a fantastic book. And it's about the Beatles, but it starts after they break up. Mm-hmm. And it's about the Beatles from like, the concept of the Beatles from like about 1970 to whenever the book was written, 2015 or something. Just about the people in the Beatles, like those 4 guys and the other people around them, their lives afterwards, but also the concept of the Beatles, Beatlemania, Beatle fandom, and how it grew and grew and grew and became this cultural phenomenon that's so much bigger than it even was when they were around, when the band was around. And, I hope he does, another chapter, another edition of that book where he talks about Get Back and that phenomenon, because this is just such an important part of that story. This is such a weird question about this movie. Yeah. Would you recommend this movie to somebody who's not just a Beatles fan, but just likes rock docs or music?
I definitely would, but I would not be especially surprised if they came back and they were like, I couldn't get through that.
Right.
It was 9 hours long,
Yeah, but people watch 72 episodes of The Office in a weekend or something nowadays. Like, who cares? Like, if you're going to watch that, whatever stuff.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's great. Whatever. Then,
when you watch this movie, do you have like a creepy smile on your face the whole time?
I do. I have to say, I watched, this week I watched it again, getting ready for this professional podcast recording. And there was a little bit of apprehension because I was like, oh my God, 8 hours? Like, I got to do this again?
Yeah.
And then it got started. And by the end, which is the rooftop concert, which we did not even talk about, which is like the most famous thing that happens in the movie.
Right.
But they played on the rooftop. It was great. But when they get to that, and I've been, over this week rewatching it, like in bits and pieces to this, and it's hour 8 and whatever. And then they're done, and then there's like the ending credits of the movie has them playing, just some of their songs. Like after the rooftop concert, they went back down to the studio and they finished up some of the work on the album
in like 2 days.
Yeah,
or a day, I think.
Yeah, and that's just playing over. They're playing The Long and Winding Road. Yeah. They're recording it, and you're watching it over the end credits. And I'm like, don't end.
Yes,
I don't want this to end.
I know.
Like, I just want more.
I finished I did a rewatch this week as well, and I finished the 3rd episode, and I was like, oh, which other episode do I want to watch right now? I've got an hour before bed. Like, do I want to put back on the first episode or the second episode?
Yeah, and there is, I mean, there is more footage of this, which I don't know. I mean, Peter said like basically like it's going to be another 50 years before any of that comes out of the Beatles vault.
Yeah,
maybe that's true, but there's all kinds of other footage of the Beatles from other eras that has never been seen. We've seen clips of it in the anthology and a few other documentaries that have come out, but there's a lot of footage around Sgt. Pepper and other things. It's not necessarily as extensive as this, like where you're going to get, 50 hours of pristine footage or whatever. But there's so much that, like, God, if somehow Disney could go to Peter Jackson and just be like, can you spend the next 20 years, like the rest of your career, doing Beatles documentaries? Like, we've got this footage.
At least
like,
spend as much time as you did on the shitty Hobbit movies.
Just like give us another Peter Jackson. Yeah, do a sequel to the whatever. But do it about whatever other Beatles footage there is. Because I don't think anybody else is going to do it.
No.
And he's the guy, whatever.
So, is there any other band, or any other musician that you could watch this of?
Guided by Voices, of course. Guided by Voices, no question. Yeah. The world would love it.
In fairness, like I could watch this for the Grateful Dead, but I recognize that there would be
the Grateful Dead, definitely.
Yeah.
We already have like a 5-hour Grateful Dead documentary. That's too short.
That's true. But I don't mean an 8-hour documentary. I mean, is there another band that you could watch 8 hours of rehearsals?
Yeah.
And the conversations they have with the people orbiting around the band. Is there any?
That's a good question, because Guided by Voices have their 30. I'm not making this up. Their 35th album is coming out. They just announced it, and I'm not sure that in their 40 years they've been together, they've rehearsed for 8 hours.
Yeah, I mean,
but but in
the
all
one that
seriousness,
immediately comes to mind is like Rolling Stones' Exile.
Sure. Well, yeah, but I mean, of course, yeah.
But like, whatever. I'm gonna watch them like.
No, but I would. If that it just doesn't exist. It's like, sure, would I be interested in watching 8 hours of Led Zeppelin 4 or 8 hours of Stevie Wonder making any of his 5 or 6 classic albums of the 70s? Like, sure. I'd watch 8 hours of Stevie Wonder making songs in the key of life all day long.
All right. That's not the right question. You're right. Is there anything else, any other band that you could do and draw a meaningfully sized audience to?
Oh no, but that's the Dreaming the Beatles book is about that. Like about how like there's no Beatles of anything else.
No. Yeah.
Like it's not even equivalent to say like, I guess you could say Michael Jordan is the Beatles of basketball or something, but it's not really the same thing. Like they just get bigger and bigger as time goes on.
Yes.
Like Michael Jordan is not bigger now than he was in 1997.
Yeah. No, and like when this thing was blowing up on Twitter over Thanksgiving weekend, you would see like 20-year-olds who like know more about the Beatles than me.
Yeah.
You're like every generation finds the Beatles.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah, they're just huge.
And also, the amount that, and I don't want to overstate this, but what a moment this movie was. It's like I went to a concert the weekend that this came out, saw Grey Boy All Stars with Carl Denson, who plays sax with the Rolling Stones on tour, and they open with Get Back.
Yeah,
it's like a treatment that is reserved for like when a famous musician dies,
right?
That if you're at a random concert that night,
they're going to pay tribute.
They're going to play tribute to that person. This documentary was like
that big
that like Ringo died this tonight, so we're going to play Octopus's Garden.
Right. Yeah. No, it's yeah. So I guess in terms of recommendations, like I hesitate to recommend it, but then everybody in the world is falling in love with it. So sure, it's recommended. We're here to say.
Yeah. Well, you watched it with family members who are not Beatles obsessives, right?
Yeah. I started watching on Thanksgiving weekend when I was with my wife's family, and they like the Beatles, but they're not like super nerds who know like, well, there's Glenn Johns. He produced Led Zeppelin's first album and went on to produce the Eagles' first album too. Ha ha. Like that's not what they're at about it. They like the Beatles songs like normal people who like good music. Right. But yeah, they watched the whole thing. And they weren't into it. They learned a lot and just were vibing with it, I guess. It's you don't have to be a super Beatles nerd to just fall in love with these 4 incredible people.
Yes.
They're just the most lovable people.
They are. Yeah, it's like I said, I said it's like a Rorschach test, who you like or who you think comes out looking good. I don't know what the Rorschach test says about me, that I think they all come across as sweethearts who I love.
Yeah.
Maybe that makes me like a people pleaser, Paul McCartney type. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you could watch this movie and not love these guys.
Well, I agree. And just to wrap it up, I guess, one of my first memories of my entire life is my mom having me repeat the phrase John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
Really?
I'm literally not making this up. I was about 4 years old, and my mom drilled that into my head. I had to know that. Huh. And then I was watching this with my 4-year-old doing the same thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like this week. And, he'll probably do the same thing with his kids, 40 years from now. It's just, we could all be gone, and the Beatles are still going to be trucking on. And
I had a conversation with my 4-year-old about John, Paul, George, and Ringo, too.
Yeah, what do you have to say about it?
He seems to like Paul.
He's a Paul guy?
Yeah.
Okay. I think Miles is into Ringo. He really likes Yellow Submarine.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I get
it's
it.
It's good entry.
Well,
he's not into Revolution number 9 or Dig a Pony or whatever.
Dig a Pony. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, compared to some of the cartoon shit I watch, Yellow Submarine leaps and bounds better.
Yellow Submarine's good stuff.
Yeah.
All right. That was Rock Docs.